name is Professor Susan James Relly. I am chair of our EDB committee in the Department of Education, and I know that academics tend to say that they're delighted, but I really, really am delighted to be here talking to you tonight to introduce Caleb for it's our inaugural EDB lecture. I'm super excited. I can't even get my words out. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Caleb has to say. He is going to talk on a question of belonging. I first met Caleb, I think it must be at least 10 years ago, if not a bit longer. Caleb was a student at Oxford, and he came to our department and was doing AQR classes. And he's just one of those students that you remember. And I don't have many regrets, but Caleb and I had talked about him staying on to do a DPhil and me being his supervisor, and he dumped me for Hillary Clinton. Can you believe it? Caleb got a job on Hillary Clinton's campaign, and he decided not to do the DPhil, and it is one of my big regrets that I never got to work with Caleb. However, I have been able to ask him, and he very, very kindly and graciously accepted to speak with us this evening on a question of belonging. Caleb is an award-winning author. He has written a huge number of things, an award-winning journalist. He writes about the history of race and identity. He is a senior fellow at Northeastern's Burns Center and is a fellow at New America, Penn America, and Harvard's Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Studies. His most recent book, We Refuse to Forget, is on pre-order, and the library has ordered a few copies, I'm very, very pleased to say, so I look forward to having a look at that. But I'm now going to hand over to Caleb to begin what I think is going to be a fantastic lecture. You know, not to preempt anything, Caleb. I'm going to turn my sound off. Please remember that this is being recorded, and if everyone can keep their mics off while Caleb's speaking, that would be very much appreciated. Caleb, take it away.
Sure thing, and no pressure, am I right? Thank you all for being here. I don't plan, I know that I have something like 45 minutes to talk, but I've never been a fan of lecturing or being lectured at, except when it's Dr. James Relly. And so as such, I'm going to make sure that I keep my comments shorter so that we might be able to engage in some conversation and be able to, extricate my voice, hopefully lecturing as the sound of God to you, but rather that you all and I can engage in conversation about what I think is perhaps one of the most central questions that we anywhere, not just within the context of America or the West, but anywhere can ask, which is how do I and can I in fact belong? A lot of my commentary today will be very Americentric, and I apologize for that in advance. However, I'm sure that many of the lessons or kind of takeaways can be scaled to just about anywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this up into about a few parts. The first of which is going to start off with a little bit of my own background. And if at any time I use any sort of words that might ring strange to you or that you don't understand, put your hand up using the raise hand function on Zoom. It's a stranger thing about communicating virtually is that we can't just quickly nudge or kick someone under a table or something of that nature. So you're going to have to use the raise hand function. I'm more than happy to explain whatsoever. So a part of it's going to be somewhat biographical. That's going to be the shortest part, right? Second part is going to be me kind of lambasting certain concepts that I think we all, at least I have glommed onto and believed in, that I think are both tangible and elusive, which kind of gets us in this trap of trying to chase after diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then we're going to talk a little bit about kind of how people have belonged historically and how those folks who kind of force fit their belonging provide lessons for us today. So a little biographical background, right? So my parents are Jamaican, born in Jamaica, grew up in Jamaica, came to the States as teenagers, moved to the Bronx and Brooklyn, where if any of you have not been to the Bronx and Brooklyn, it is Jamaica like #2, right? It's kind of like being in Brixton back in the day or what have you, where it's just all Jamaicans, all Caribbeans all of the time. And so as such, I never really had, growing up, at least in this part of my life, much by the way of questioning my identity, who I was, or my belonging, right? To some extent, I would put last my American or Western identity markers and put first my Jamaican ones, right? I was around Jamaican people all the time, ate Jamaican food. I went to a church that my grandfather, who was Jamaican, pastored, where the deacons and elders and vicars of the church were all Jamaican, Barbadian, Bajan, Bahamian. I can go on down the list, St. Lucian and all. And so as such, I never really had to wonder, right? I never spent any time wondering. I went to a school where the teachers were all Jamaican. We were sang songs that were Jamaican. Our songs that we would sing in class were Jamaican national anthems. We really didn't have to worry about wondering whether or not I belonged. And then my parents got the interesting, I won't call it wise, but the interesting idea to pick up from the Bronx, where we were surrounded by people who knew us, people who looked like us, people who talked like us, people whose patois was of a similar variety, whose love of things both spicy and savory was kind of standard. And we picked up and we moved to Oklahoma. And for most of the people, I remember when I came to Oxford, people would ask me, where exactly is Oklahoma? People, and you would assume that these people who were asking were not from the United States, but often there were people who were from the United States, who grew up learning the geography of the United States would still ask, where exactly is Oklahoma? And Oklahoma, for all of you who don't know, is right smack dab on top of Texas. To some extent, you can almost feel as if we're Texas light, except with none of the bells and whistles, none of the interesting things. We're just Oklahoma. And I think my parents were attracted. I'm still confused as to why they moved there. To be perfectly blunt with you, they both work in healthcare, right? They could presumably work anywhere. It wasn't like as if they were interested in the industries that are what Oklahoma became known for, which is like oil and gas. They were healthcare workers. And so you would assume they could go anywhere, but they went there in part because, unlike New York, it wasn't nearly as cosmopolitan, busy, or interesting, right? It wasn't nearly as colorful, right? Oklahoma is bland and it is brown. In certain parts, it's red dirt that you would see. There's nothing, I want to emphasize this, there is nothing exciting about Oklahoma whatsoever. And all of a sudden, I was plopped down into a school, into an educational environment in which I was the only kid who looked like me. I was the only kid who talked like me. I was the kid who was made fun of for the sort of food I would bring from leftovers from the night before to lunch. I was the kid who was ostracized, called a gorilla, called the N-word, called every other name in the book. And so all of a sudden, the question wasn't, do I belong here? It was a resounding answer that I heard instead of the question, which was, I do not belong here. Right? And that's to some extent been the project of kind of American imperialism, right, in the United States. The project has in many cases been to ensure that there are very finite boxes within which one can fit, right? And race has been used often for the bad to distinguish people, not just one from another, but to pit one against one another, such that one always then begins to wonder if they're not a white male cisgender straight guy, right? That whether or not I belong and whether or not I can prosper in the US is whether or not is going to be tied inextricably to whether or not I can fit into these boxes. And so for me growing up, I just kind of assumed that in order for me to be more American, in order for me to fit and belong, I had to shed the vestiges of my upbringing, who I was, what I looked like. So I knew, for instance, AI couldn't change what I looked like. I wasn't particularly interested in going under a bleaching exercise like Michael Jackson did. It seemed difficult. And besides, everyone knows what Michael Jackson looked like when he was a kid. that was a little bit of hilarity for anyone who wanted a break from the sad story of my upbringing. But Michael Jackson's route was not going to be pursued by me. I wasn't rich, couldn't do it, right? And so as such, I ended up glomming onto perspectives, political and philosophical and moral perspectives that would not, right, be aligned at all with my upbringing, right? I didn't believe, for instance, as a child, that the Civil Rights Act was necessarily nearly as good for people like me, right? I started to adopt perspectives that were antithetical to my ability to prosper and live in America. I have family who existed on various government welfare programs, but then began, like Ronald Reagan, to say that, well, those are really for welfare queens and people who push, poverty, what do you call them, poverty pimps and whatnot. I began to adopt some of these perspectives because I, again, so desperately wanted to belong. And it really wasn't until, right, a particular instance, which I've written about, when I got kind of lost in a classroom, in a school's library, and found a book that shouldn't have been there, which was about the autobiography of Malcolm X, written by Alex Haley, that I realized that I was not the only person who felt as if they didn't belong. And even though I won't say that I align with all of Brother Malcolm X's perspectives and views, it kind of created an aperture where one didn't exist, to explore perhaps a different kind of belonging, one in which I created my own box, identified where I should sit, that perhaps these boxes that people have created for me that I got no say in creating myself weren't necessarily supposed to exist to begin with, not in its current form. And that led me to becoming this very, very kind of, in Oklahoma, we would say stick in his craw, or perhaps it's best to just say an incredible annoyance to the faculty and the administration of that school, where I began to wonder, and I didn't have the language, I didn't have the flowing rhetoric, I wasn't quoting Fanon, I wasn't quoting Baldwin, I wasn't quoting Bell Hooks or anyone of that nature. I was just realizing that perhaps my project in life isn't necessarily to belong in a place that doesn't want me, but rather to make that place accept me, regardless of whether or not they want me. That's kind of the project of belonging. And that's why my autobiographical tale really helpfully hopes to provide a human face, the one that you see in front of you, to help you then reconsider belonging. And to me, to my second part of this conversation, not so much a lecture, leads to my second point, which is really about, in my opinion, it's going to be very full-throated and probably somewhat bombastic, and maybe polarizing. I'm more than happy to talk about it in detail with all of you. But that's why I feel as if a lot of programs that we use, right, ones that are kind of heralded under that's why I love the fact that this community and this group that Dr. James Relly, I know she tells me to call her Susan, but again, I told you I was raised by Jamaicans, and that wasn't allowed to call people by their first names, especially people who were once our professors. But at any rate, why I love coming to talk to you all is because the question isn't necessarily whether or not we are diverse, right? The question is belonging, right? Because in my opinion, there is an innate human desire to want to belong somewhere. There isn't always necessarily an innate human desire to ensure that there is diversity. And if one is chasing diversity, which I believe is a knock-on effect, perhaps, of creating an environment in which people can belong, right? If we're chasing the outworking or the perk, right, of belonging, as opposed to belonging itself, we'll never actually get to a place where people feel as if they belong. So let me give you an example, right? There are numerous DE&I or DEI initiatives around the country, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And it's both tangible in that one can essentially establish their own standard or rubric for saying we are now a diverse company, we are now a diverse school, we are now a diverse organization or institution of some kind or another, right? Or, right, we can do that, and we can also say that we care about equity and we want to be inclusive, right? So it's tangible in that we can count people, we can get people into a bean counting exercise where we're essentially identifying how many Blacks do we have in the room, right? Where we're essentially asking ourselves, how many people who are lower income do we have in the room, right? And because, of course, people's identities are dispersed and intersectional, right? We then start to get into these interesting conversations which I've been a part in various organizations I've worked for since being at Oxford, in which people then ask, well, how many gay Black men from this part of the country do we have in the room? As opposed to wondering, systematically within this organization, have we created an institution that is accessible to all people who desire to be at this organization, right? Then we say things like equity and inclusion, which sure, we can add some rigorous quantitative or qualitative standards whereby we say we are more inclusive than we once were. But instead, we say we want to be inclusive, full stop, right? So we pair the tangible, being able to count a variety of people who look a certain way, sound a certain way, come from certain places, right? And say, we are now more diverse. And then we say we want to be inclusive, we say we want to be equitable, without actually realizing that we're not attacking the very systematic or core considerations that then create these institutions, and ask ourselves whether or not they're pointing us in the direction of belonging. So we get ourselves tied in chasing both the elusive whilst also chasing the very tangible all at the same time, right? So that's why I've never been a fan of diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, in part because I don't necessarily see them aiming towards much of what we need. And I saw that David just came off of mute. David, did you have a question?
Sorry, no, it was a mistake. My fault. Carry on. Forgive me.
No worries. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't going to run roughshod over you. So then to the question of belonging, how do we do that, right? And I think there are a variety of ways. And so I'm going to admit up front that I do not contain the myriad ways one can begin to feel as if they belong, or that institutions can transform themselves such that they do belong. But I think that one particular way that I have chosen, right, is the excavation of history, right? And in many ways, that oftentimes feels like a massive endeavor that takes PhDs in history and anthropology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And no doubt, those sorts of disciplines do help us scaffold our way to a more informed way of being, right? By examining who we have been, and then perhaps who we then can become. But I also think that lay people such as myself, I would consider myself a lay person. I do not have a PhD in history, don't have a PhD in anything. However, it's in exploring who we have been, right, and opening ourselves up to that exploration that we get there. Now, there are two things I want to do in this. One, I'm going to give you a very specific example of how that has happened for me and in my own career, but then also discuss the very real threat to that that's happening, not just in the US, but in other places. So to some extent, looking at my own personal experiences, I grew up as a Black kid in Oklahoma feeling completely and totally ostracized, not realizing that where I stood in Oklahoma was a wellspring of history that is uniquely Black and uniquely Indigenous. So when we look at Tulsa, right, we see a place that is predominantly white. We see a place, and there's nothing wrong with a place being predominantly white, right? But there's a problem with it being predominantly white at the exclusion of remembering who else is there and who else has been there, right? And so in this place that was predominantly white, feeling like I didn't fit in, without realizing that 1 block away was a cemetery that contained the Perriman family. The Perrimans were there was actually a historian named Angie DeBow who wrote once that they were the most curious admixture of identity and power in the United States history, right? And I was like, oh, who are these people? So Legis Perriman and Josiah Perriman and Mose Perriman, all the people I just mentioned had very different tones, right? Legis looked more like me. Josiah looked a little less like me because he was lighter and fairer in his skin tone. And then Mose was a white man who was, known to actually have slaves. Legis was, all three of them, however, were part of the same indigenous nation or tribe called the Creek Nation, right? This was in my backyard. This was in line of sight of my school. And these folks were the folks who actually helped to found Tulsa. They were considered the founding fathers of Tulsa. And I don't want to dive too deep into that history. I don't want to lose anyone in the details of it. But Legis Perriman, Black guy, looked like me, was in charge of a Native American nation called the Creek Nation. His father, Mose, was an incredibly astute, but also slave-holding guy, right? These individuals, what I think excavating history does, these complexities that are oftentimes confusing, is that it adds to the humanity of people, right? When we strip away all of the good or all of the bad, right? We do two things. We create less room for people to belong who might they themselves be complex because they're human. And then two, we strip away the opportunity for us to learn a great deal about who we have been. And so to me, my projects in life, whether it's this story of the Creek Nation and Black people who were once enslaved but also citizens of it, whether it's exploring what has happened in places like Milwaukee or the Caribbean or other places, the goal for me at least is to create more ways, more pathways for people to access history, which might then also help them inform identities that they might have or they might see around them. Now, I promised that I was going to talk about what threat exists, right? So I don't know how many of you are paying attention to the fights, the cultural wars that we're having in the US, right? But there is a rush in many states around the country, my state included, Oklahoma, Texas, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. There is a major push across the country to ban books that reflect on these histories that don't necessarily paint the West or America in the best light, that tarnishes the notion that America or the West are cities on a hill, right? That tarnishes the notion that perhaps we haven't been perfect always, right? Because when we, again, just to go back to what I just said, when we strip away parts of our identity, our history rather, especially the ones that aren't good, we remove the possibility of helping children, helping young people, helping all people realize that one doesn't have to always be perfect in order to get better, right? But anyways, in the United States, there is an active effort. It's done under a felonious title, CRT, critical race theory. These textbooks have nothing to do with critical race theory. However, right, critical race theory being a legal academic concept that was developed by people like Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell, these phenomenal legal scholars of our past, has nothing to do with that, right? But they're actively trying to uproot the parts of our stories that might tell a more checkered past, that might spell that we might have a more difficult road to get to the sort of progress that we're experiencing or want to experience now. That's the context within which people like myself, writers, people who are lovers and kind of disseminators of public history are fighting against now, right? Is the question of whether or not we're going to remember the fullness of American history, that America, that the West hasn't always been perfect. It's still not perfect, right? And that to some extent, dissenting from the notion that there's always been linear progress might in fact be the most patriotic thing that we can do. So I believe that part of creating belonging is by creating, not even creating, but excavating the complex, the beautifully complex, rich histories that have built the way to where we are right now. So then what do we do, right? What then do we do? And this is where I'll stop talking because I know it's already been almost 25 minutes. But one thing I wanted to offer as a solution, right, was the commitment to identifying more complex stories, right? To dive into, not just dive into it, but by making them more public. And for me, I always felt as if, I don't feel as if, but my educational experience has been the most instructive, most influential thing in the shaping of who I am today, right? For, as you all heard, for the first few, for the first almost couple of decades, it was pretty dark, right? Right? It was enmeshed in feeling like I didn't belong, right? It was reading textbooks that were designed by the very people who were segregationists, people who kind of instituted their own version of American apartheid, who supported apartheid in South Africa, right? Those were the very same people like Bob Jones and the people who were founders of Abeka Books, right? These toxic textbooks that created how I saw the world at that time, that diminished my Blackness, my Caribbeanness, my foreignness within the United States, that made my foreignness, given that most people in the United States are foreigners and immigrants, right? It made my immigrant status less than all the other sort of immigrants who just happen to not look like me, right? So to me, the best thing that we can do, the thing that we can do for all people, is gift each other with the opportunity to tell more of our own stories, right? So one of the ways in which this is happening is that I and several other authors have partnered with a large grantor to collect oral histories. Part of how I know a lot about the Perriman family or the history of Oklahoma or the West or the Plain States is in part because during the Great Depression, during the 1930s and early 40s, the Roosevelt administration created something called the Federal Writers Project because, of course, there were a ton of out-of-work writers. Doesn't seem like things have changed, right? I'm kidding. There are tons of out-of-work writers and playwrights, so on and so forth, that went across the country collecting oral histories. And so we wanted to bring some of that back because a lot of the history that we have, sadly, in the United States isn't really scribbled down on textbooks. A lot of it's not there, right? And so we wanted to add to the ledger by talking to people around the country. And the biggest blessing, the biggest gift that I've been given are these stories, right? They're not professional, they're not, experts in the history of identity in America. These are ordinary folks who are perhaps on some of their last breaths, sharing those last breaths with me, telling me about the world in which they lived in. And I think to some extent, perhaps one of the ways in which we begin to belong more is the sharing of these public stories, right? Or sharing of these stories and making them public, providing access for people where they didn't formally think it existed, where they become, at least to some extent, more certain that regardless of where they might come from, they have a story to add to the conversation that might be useful. So for me, enough with diversity. I'm glad this group has kind of gotten to that point long before I had this conversation, but more towards belonging, more towards the sharing of stories that complicate our identity stories, right? That complicate what it means to be anything. Perhaps that way we can add to the humanity of people we've for so long diminished. So let me stop there and pause and turn it back over either to Susan. See, I said it for the first time ever out loud, to Susan or anyone else who might have any questions for me. I wanted to make sure that I didn't belabor any of the points so long that folks didn't get the opportunity to engage in some conversation.
Caleb, thank you. That is huge food for thought. And yeah, just brilliant. Thank you so much. Lots of hands. Questions, please. There are bound to be. Natasha. Natasha, could you just, I've already said your name, but just your role in the department, etc.
Oh, sure. Yes, so I'm a postdoc in the department. I work on history education and particularly the history of marginalized peoples and how they understand the legacies of those histories. So everything you were saying was really fascinating and fantastic. I guess in terms, I really liked your point about like this difference between diversity and inclusion, because obviously in the education department, we are quite diverse, or at least the student body is quite diverse, but we know that lots of the students don't feel included or don't feel like they belong in this department. And obviously in part that has to do with kind of Oxford as a whole and its kind of institutional legacy. But when thinking about these, uncovering these histories or these plural narratives, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how to do that at an institutional level. I think, like, obviously Rhodes Must Fall is kind of interesting in this, in the way that Oxford as an institution chooses to memorialize the past, but I'm thinking more in terms of the Department of Education or on a departmental level.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I have like a million questions about like how that history, education then informs sense making, and a million other inquiries. But anyways, I think that to some extent, right, I think a few things. One, I think that there's the kind of collective project that one can, not one, but an institution can engage in kind of collective retelling of history, right? So, you know, an institution I'm affiliated with here, Harvard, is kind of starting to do that, right? And has been doing that for a while. And it's been a reckoning, right? And it's invited harsh criticism, blunt criticism, direct, precise criticism, right? It's compelled Harvard to begin the process by offering some semblance of reparations, but it's also meant deploying kind of the talent that Harvard already has to engage in reconsidering what role and impact it's had throughout time on marginalized people, right? I mean, that's, I think, part of the benefit that institutions that are so, I'm trying to find the right word, so impressive, let's say, right, is that inside of those institutions, right, they have the talent to actually do the work. They have perhaps even, and this is going to sound terrible, they have probably, unlike so many other individuals who are not considered elite or impressive, right, those who might be considered lower income or what have you, whose lives are more tenuous and difficult to manage, right, these institutions, these academic institutions have more time, right? Like literal time to actually then do that work. So I think, you know, I'm not as tied into what the Department of Education is currently doing, what it currently looks like, but perhaps, right, it is the institution within Oxford that prides itself on focusing on how do we learn, that might perhaps be the right institution to then kind of compel both the Department of Education and then all the other colleges that then make up Oxford to then reconsider how we tell our story, right? And reconsider whether or not that story even needs to be linear, right? So I think it's also a very much so a Western convention that the story must be linear, right? And that there must be some sort of resolution. And I don't necessarily think that's necessary here, right? I think that's probably where I think even in the oral history work that I've done, like there's not a result for someone who probably grew up in a tough rural area that the life just has gotten harder. There's no like happy resolution there, right? There's only tension, but a productive tension nevertheless. And so I think perhaps Department of Education, which might understand those complexities and the implications of the complexities, might be the one to then lead that work. I'm just offering an idea. I'm not as tied into the inner workings of Oxford nor the Department of Education. That's just my first blush look and take on it.
That's really interesting. Thanks.
No problem.
David.
So I can't unmute my video, but I can just, that serves me right for unmuting myself earlier. I'm not sure why. You have to listen. Oh, there, I'm allowed to now. That's brilliant. Thank you, Susan. So that was brilliant, kind of a really fascinating and important, provocative, lots and lots for us to think about. So I'm just going to, one reflection comes from an event that some colleagues recently organised in Oxford on the history of of racism in Oxford, which humbled me and made me think quite hard about what sort of environment we have here. And it was a mixture of, there was a book in the 60s published called Disappointed Guests, where about 12 students from around the world wrote about just how unwelcoming Oxford was for them. And the event was sort of designed to revisit that history and think about the difficult histories that Oxford hasn't really grappled with. And so in relation to what you were saying about belonging, some activists came to that conference and said, we wouldn't recommend others to come to Oxford. It's such a violent place. It's not ready. And that sort of made me think, gosh, you know, we almost need to start from the position that we actively, you know, we might think we're an environment which creates belonging, but actually we often don't. And that's not a lot of unlearning, I think, for us, perhaps, to recognize what we do that might feel friendly, but actually is actually sometimes not. And so what you were saying about just how hard it is to create stories that make people feel, you know, enable people to feel their stories can be heard. There's several steps before that, aren't there? Which is, you know, how do we signal that we recognize that we've often been a place that hasn't made people feel they belong? And, you know, worse than that, it's often been a place which is excluded, and the stories of Oxford's exclusions are many and manifold. And then to start to say, well, look, you know, how can we unlearn what we've done? So I'm not sure if I've turned this into a question, but I think what I'm saying here is I absolutely agree with you about letting people tell other stories such that they can feel they can belong within that. But it's also about how do we recognize that? How do we make spaces for those stories, or how do we recognize that we need to unlearn what we think we have ourselves?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, in part because it kind of forced me to reflect about how so many other individuals throughout time have kind of really leveraged a lot of, you know, appreciative inquiry, right? Especially when approaching those, such as myself, who might be from marginalized communities, right, where the goal is really, yes, to engage in some deep listening, but that it's rooted in the desire to kind of identify trying to say this carefully, identify ways in which those who are not marginalized can better hear both the struggles and strains, but also triumphs and opportunities that have been crafted by those on the margins of society, right? And I think that's pretty hard, right? I think additionally, right, there's this, you know, within the US context, when it comes to questions of, like, you know, reconciliation and reparations, right? Like, that things will never be truly reconciled unless we actually understand the truth of what happened first, right? We then make an effort to then repair given the truth that we've learned. And then disparate communities, right, can then be reconciled. And I think oftentimes we show up to these conversations ready to reconcile, right? But then sitting right under all of that reconciliation that's been supposedly crafted is a lot of untold truths that also have not been repaired, right? So that's I think kind of the frame that we need to come to these conversations with, which is, let's just learn the truth first, and be okay that it might take a really long time to, like, tease out all the aspects of that truth. And then we can talk about what do we do to then repair, realizing that repairing anything means that I'm going to give something up in order to give you something so that you can begin the reparation process. So I think, like, it's, as you're mentioning, really, it's a question of how are we starting the framing to begin with, that then oftentimes can get us off on the wrong foot before we've had the opportunity to have a real conversation.
That's really helpful. Thank you. That's great.
No problem.
Steve.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much. For me, it was brilliant, and there's so much that it's kind of made me think about. But there's a comment that you made earlier saying, kind of after you described some of your kind of experiences and some of the kind of critical questions that you've been asking, and you said, like, I hadn't been reading like Frantz Fanon or anyone at that point, and I was just really interested when you started reading, like, Fanon or whoever. Like, how was that experience? Like, what kind of questions did that raise? Did that just kind of like chime with those critical questions you'd already been raising, or like, yeah, how did that work?
Yeah, no, I mean, those were really tough, right? I think because, you know, when you are inundated with something so antithetical from, you know, the Fanons of the world, right? There's a resistance. There's an immediate resistance to accepting what anything that might be different to what I've learned, what I had learned to that point. There's a strong resistance to accepting not even the truth of it, but the logic of it, right? Such that I felt like, oh my goodness, the only thing that I had known to be my world was kind of crumbling, right? Whilst at the same time, right, trying to reconcile that with, man, like this is helping, this animates and explains so much of what I've experienced. Because you have to understand, I mean, being that one kid, it's painful, right? It's hurtful, it's harmful. And so for all of a sudden, there's this balm, if you will, like a BALM balm, that's almost applied to a lot of wounds that were left open, right? By reading some of this work and learning some of this history. So like, I think that's part of the reason why, even when I like pen articles that, or pieces or books or whatever, that I know challenge kind of conventional thinking, like I'm okay with the fact that people's immediate responses are resistance. I think that's normal, right? And I think oftentimes people who are in my work, or line of work, get very upset and angry when people don't immediately accept what they're saying is gospel, right? But if we're almost to take this to a, you know, overtly kind of Christian context, right? When Jesus came supposedly to a bunch of disciples and was, you know, proselytizing, a lot of those people who were disciples they weren't born disciples, they had to become convinced. And so I think likewise, in the context of reading all these different people, I was deeply resistant. I was a doubter, whilst at the same time realizing that there was something to it that was helping to explain away some of the pain that I have felt.
Awesome, thanks so much.
No problem.
Vicky.
Hi, thank you. Hi, I'm Victoria Murphy. I'm a professor of applied linguistics in the department and also the director of the department. I enjoyed your talk very much, and thank you very much for being part of this. I want to ask a simple question, but I don't think it has a simple answer, but I'm interested in your take on it, which relates to how to accommodate multiple truths. So you have used the word truth a number of times in your discussion and your talk. You talked about the importance of us learning the truth. You just talked about the Gospels. And I think what you're actually talking about in terms of sharing stories is indeed the notion that there are potentially multiple truths, and that there are can be very different perspectives around maybe the same event or the same cultural ideal or whatever it may be. And that's in a sense at the heart of the matter potentially, is that there are these multiple truths that don't always necessarily align. So how would you recommend, if we create a platform or allow for a platform where people, whoever they may be, have the opportunity to share their stories, for us to get to know their truths, when there are incompatibilities between these stories, how do we reconcile those?
Yeah, so somewhat dissatisfying answer that I'm going to give. I almost want to push back on the need to reconcile those disparate truths, right? I think, I think I think often about how, the notion of intersectionality kind of is rooted in the notion of multiple truths, right? Like, you can likewise be a Black person who loves a Black person who is an ardent Christian or fill in the blank for any sort of faith, believes those faiths, knows themselves to believe that this is who they are, knows that they're Black, right? But then also has to then come to grips with the sort of historical damage that organized religion has had on people who are also Black within the African continent, right? Or you have to reconcile the fact, there's a quote by, one of my favorite quotes, in part because I'm finishing this piece for the New York Times Magazine about it, about the Southern Baptist Convention, is that Frederick Douglass has this brilliant quote. So Frederick Douglass, former slave, for all those who aren't, former slave who becomes, teaches himself how to read, becomes one of the most, illustrious abolitionists at that time. And he wrote, "For all the slaveholders I have met, religious slaveholders are the worst. And I have found them to be the meanest and the basest, the most cruel and cowardly of all the others," right? And I think even in that, he's demonstrating this, how adept he is at kind of dealing with a variety of truths, right? That you can espouse these notions of Christianity whilst at the same time being of the most based and cowardly of individuals. And so I think to some extent, I don't know how much effort should be placed into trying to reconcile or cohere such disparate truths, rather that one should be focused on first elevating those truths and then trying to figure out in what ways have we, not necessarily demonstrated a preferential treatment for those. And again, I'm speaking as someone who clearly has some political and philosophical perspectives on all of this, but to what extent are we not providing a preferential treatment for those who have been marginalized, right? And so I think that's not so much how I reconcile truths, that's how I kind of side with one versus the other, right? And advance one versus the other, right? So for me, I'm not as interested in reconciling them or cohering them. I'm more so interested in elevating them and then being very clear that my orientation is towards justice and belonging. And some of those truths don't lead me closer towards justice or belonging whatsoever, right? In fact, some of those truths, are divisive and deride me from actually the goal of trying to do what's absolutely best for providing the preferential treatment towards the marginalized. So I probably don't have much of a fairness doctrine that's guiding most of my thinking when it comes to that, but that's where I end up landing.
Are there any other questions? Gossie has put a comment in the chat. What you're saying reminds her a lot about a TED talk that she listened to, The Danger of a Single Story.
Mm-hmm.
Heath, sorry, I didn't see your hand. I just caught it out of the corner of my eye.
No, it just went up. So I think I have a somewhat more practical question, just thinking about issues that we face in organizations like Oxford. And I was quite interested in you earlier, you said you work quite closely with some organizations, particularly in equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I was quite struck by what you were saying, to say we maybe need to, rethink elements such as diversity in terms of belonging. And I kind of wanted to hear a little bit more about your thoughts about how organizations or committees can go about embracing or rethinking the way that we go about EDI from a belonging sense of view, in a simple sense. And a lot of the committees that we might have in organizations like Oxford, I feel like we chase EDI through diversity and we think that the other things will follow, that if we can make the committee diverse, then equality, inclusion, belonging will follow. And I'm not sure actually whether that's true. So in an undiverse organization, it could also have negative consequences for those people that are then dragged into multiple committees and have extra workload. So I was just wondering, I just wanted to hear your thoughts about ways that organizations like Oxford on committees, we can kind of solve this issue and change the conversation to belonging.
Certainly, certainly. Yeah, I think it bears repeating that I think diversity and representation are great things, right? And I think we'd all agree to that on this call or on this virtual session together. However, I think though that as I mentioned, when that's kind of goal number one, you kind of are missing the target, right? It's kind of like, treating a sneeze and realizing the person has COVID, right? And saying, perhaps we fix this cough, as opposed to maybe you should distance, stay at home and wear a mask, right? So the ways in which I've seen like organizations actually do that, I think you're asking like more of a practical question, right? And so I think that diversity being good aside, I've seen some organizations really focus more of their work on kind of interrogating some of the implicit biases that they have, right? Really compelling people to kind of think carefully about what are those biases, but then following that up, not just with here are the biases, right? Like, I am this bias, hooray, not stopping there, but perhaps also then saying, well, these things are, one, you can kind of help people not feel crappy about those biases they have by both putting it within the context of how the world thinks or how that given geography thinks, right? Kind of standardizing it or kind of putting it up against how generally people feel, but then also informing it by history. So one thing that I can say that even one of my alma mater organization or institutions did was that, yeah, they had for years the implicit bias training, right? The sort of training where you sit in front of your computer, you click through as fast as possible, you answer all the questions, right? With all of the responses, all the multiple choice questions with all the answers, and so you get the green light to keep on going. We've all done this, right? And then it's kind of a pro forma activity that one doesn't really want to do, but we do because they're withholding our healthcare or paycheck or our standing in the university or something like that. So what my institution did was not only do they have that, but then they have this kind of abbreviated course that everyone is required to take in person that essentially goes through, where did this come from? How did we get here? How do we channel learning this history into better treating one another? How do we unpack, as was it Jennifer Anion, or I can't remember, unpacking the invisible knapsacks that we all have, and thinking carefully about what privileges that comes with, right? So and then also just learning the history of that given place, right? And so I think that it sounds like a huge undertaking, but with the upside being that we are educating and training people who then identify what their biases are, realize what's been informing them, giving them the tools to then realize how do we in our working lives then see to it that we are not replicating some of the injustices that we've seen all of our lives. The reward is huge, right? And I think sometimes I hate to use like overly capitalist terms, but like, it's almost a matter of kind of putting it in investment terms that, like, for this relatively light lift, right, we're getting so much in return, not just as an institution, not just as individuals, but really as a society. We're training people who really have a better sense of that. And I think it took a lot of work to get my institution there, but they're now doing it, right? And it is far from perfect. It never will be perfect. I think that's the last thing, just really quickly, right? As scientifically as we want to approach this stuff, right? I think the reason diversity kind of satiates our appetite, at least temporarily, is because we're offering numbers, right? Like we once had 2 Black people, we now have 5. We once had 3 low-income students, we now have 18, right? And that satiates the desire, right? That makes us feel really good, right? But to admit to ourselves that there's nothing about belonging that will ever feel perfect. And there's nothing about it that's static, right? That to some extent, we're going to have to continue evolving. The students that are going to enter any given institution will change over time. What they're going to need is going to change over time. The things that they're facing on the world on the other side of that educational experience will be changing all the time. And so as such, equipping them to better understand what's going to face them, what's facing them now is part and parcel of the task, such that we're not admitting that it's perfect. We're not admitting that it's static. So I know it's a really long-winded way of saying, I think that identifying biases, figuring out how they're informed, making sure that we're proselytizing it across the board so that everyone kind of has a baseline of understanding, but then also admitting to ourselves that that baseline is going to shift over time. It's going to change over time. It's going to change based on who's in the room. So meeting people where they are is going to be the most critical component of all of it. I know it's a super long answer. I apologize.
Caleb, I think that was the perfect answer on which to finish tonight's talk. I think there have been huge lessons in here for us, particularly the EDB committee, to take forward as we work, and especially around what you were saying about implicit bias training. I've made lots of notes, but just this whole notion of belonging, and that is one of the things that we would like to really move on, is to make this department somewhere that people feel that they belong, taking into account Natasha's earlier comments. And it's something that we're working on. And, you know, and I think until we address our truths, it's not going to be straightforward. But you have given us a huge amount to think about, and hugely appreciate your time this afternoon. And I think if we were in person, there'd be a huge round of applause, but unfortunately we're on the screen, but there are definitely claps, and then there's lots of comments in the chat.
I appreciate you all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience. Thank you to everyone for joining. We now have a lot of work to do. So let's get cracking. We had a lot of work to do beforehand. I think now what we've got is a much better sense of direction. So thank you, Caleb. Hugely appreciate it.
No problem. Happy to.